The phone rang at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, cutting through the silence of my studio apartment in downtown Chicago. I fumbled for it in the darkness, my heart already racing because early morning calls never brought good news. My sister Rachel's voice came through the speaker, shaky and raw with tears. "Emma, she's gone," she whispered, and I didn't need to ask who. Grandma Rose had been battling pneumonia for weeks, but somehow I thought she'd pull through like she always did. I sat, up in bed, the cool October air from my cracked window making me shiver as reality hit. The woman who raised me after Mom died, who taught me to bake apple pies and stand up for myself, was no longer in this world. Rachel was sobbing now, barely coherent as she tried to explain how peaceful it had been. The nurses said Grandma had been asking for both of us right until the end. I pressed my palm against my chest, feeling like my heart might actually break. "The funeral's on Friday," Rachel managed between sniffles, her voice echoing in what I assumed was the hospital corridor. "Can you get time off work?" I was already mentally calculating what I'd need to cancel, which client meetings I'd have, to reschedule. My job at the marketing firm had been demanding lately, but nothing mattered more than being there for Grandma Rose. She deserved every bit of love and respect we could give her in these final moments. The silence stretched between us for a moment, filled only by Rachel's occasional sniffles and the distant sound of Chicago traffic beginning its morning rush. I realized I hadn't said much, still processing the enormity of losing the one person who'd been our anchor since childhood. "I'll be there," I finally whispered, my voice barely audible. "I'll catch the first flight to Portland tomorrow." The thought of facing that empty house, of going through her belongings, made my stomach churn. As I hung up and stared at my phone's black screen, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. Not just because we'd lost Grandma Rose, but because something in Rachel's voice had sounded different. There was an edge there I couldn't quite place, a tension that went beyond grief. I pushed the thought away, telling myself I was overthinking things. After all, we were both devastated and probably not thinking clearly. The next few hours passed in a blur of phone calls to my boss, frantic packing and booking the earliest flight I could find. I threw my black dress into my suitcase along with some casual clothes, not really sure how long I'd need to stay. The apartment felt strange and hollow as I moved through it, like I was already somewhere else. My hands shook as I zipped up my luggage, and I had to sit down on the edge of my bed to steady myself. By noon, I was on a plane to Portland, watching Chicago shrink below me through the small oval window. The businessman next to me was typing furiously on his laptop, completely absorbed in his work, while I sat there with tears threatening to spill over. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through old photos of Grandma Rose, her bright smile at last Christmas, her hands covered in flour as we baked together, her proud face at my college graduation. Each image felt like a small knife to my heart. The flight attendant offered me peanuts and a drink, her professional smile faltering slightly when she saw my red-rimmed eyes. "Flying home for something difficult?" she asked gently, and I nodded, not trusting my voice to explain. She squeezed my shoulder briefly before moving on, a small gesture of kindness that nearly broke my composure completely. I spent the rest of the flight staring out at the clouds, trying to prepare myself for what lay ahead. When we began our descent into Portland, I could see the familiar outline of Mount Hood in the distance, its snow-capped peak catching the afternoon sunlight. This was home in a way Chicago had never been, even though I'd lived there for almost 8 years. Every summer of my childhood had been spent in Grandma Rose's Victorian house on Elm Street, with its creaky floors and the smell of lavender sachets she kept in every closet. The thought of that house without her laughter filling it seemed impossible to bear. As the plane touched down with a gentle bump, I closed my eyes and whispered a small prayer to whatever force might be listening. I asked for strength to get through the next few days, for the right words to comfort Rachel, and for the courage to say goodbye to the woman who'd shaped both of us into who we'd become. Little did I know that by the end of the week, I'd need that strength for reasons I never could have imagined. Rachel was waiting for me at baggage claim, her usually perfect blonde hair pulled back in a messy ponytail and her eyes swollen from crying. She looked smaller somehow, like grief had physically diminished her. and when she saw me, she broke into fresh tears. We held each other right there in the middle of the busy terminal, two sisters clinging to each other, while travelers rushed around us with their wheeled suitcases and busy lives. "I can't believe she's really gone," Rachel whispered against my shoulder, her voice muffled and broken. The drive to Grandma's house took us through the familiar streets of our childhood, past the elementary school where we'd learned to read, and the park where we'd spent countless summer afternoons. Rachel drove her pristine white SUV with one hand, using the other to occasionally wipe her eyes with tissues from a box on the center console. She'd always been the more emotional one, between us wearing her feelings on her sleeve while I tended to internalize everything. But today, her raw grief felt almost overwhelming, filling the car like a thick fog. "The house feels so empty," she said as we turned onto Elm Street, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been staying there since Monday, trying to organize things, but every creak makes me think she's coming down the stairs." I could see what she meant as soon as we pulled into the driveway. The Victorian house that had always seemed so alive and welcoming now looked hollow, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the street. The garden Grandma Rose had tended so lovingly was starting to show signs of autumn neglect. Inside, the silence was deafening. The grandfather clock in the hallway was still ticking, marking time that Grandma Rose would never see again, and her reading glasses were still on the side table next to her favorite armchair. Rachel had clearly been trying to keep busy. There were neat stacks of papers on the dining room table and several boxes labeled donations in the corner. But despite her efforts, the house felt frozen in time, waiting for someone who would never return. "I made coffee," Rachel said, her voice artificially bright as she headed toward the kitchen. "And I picked up some of those cookies from Morrison's bakery that you always liked." She was trying so hard to take care of me, to create some semblance of normalcy in the midst of our shared devastation. I followed her into the kitchen, where the familiar smell of Grandma's lavender dish soap still lingered in the air. Everything was exactly as it had always been, from the ceramic rooster on the windowsill to the magnetic poetry on the refrigerator. We sat at the small breakfast table where we'd eaten countless bowls of cereal during summer visits, the silence stretching between us like an old, comfortable blanket. Rachel's hands wrapped around her coffee mug as if seeking warmth, and I noticed she'd lost weight since I'd seen her last Christmas. Her wedding ring caught the afternoon light streaming through the lace curtains, reminding me that she had her husband David and their 8-year-old son Tyler to go home to. I had my career and my independence, but suddenly those things felt cold and insufficient. "The funeral director wants to meet with us tomorrow," Rachel said, pulling a business card from the stack of papers. "We need to finalize the arrangements and pick out—" She trailed off, unable to say the word casket out loud. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand, feeling the calluses on her fingers from her work as a nurse. She'd always been the caregiver in our family, the one who rushed to help whenever someone was hurt or sick. It made sense that she'd been here with Grandma Rose at the end while I was hundreds of miles away, buried in spreadsheets and client presentations. "Have you called Aunt Patricia?" I asked, referring to our mother's older sister who lived in Seattle. Rachel nodded, explaining that our aunt would arrive Thursday night and stay through the weekend. She'd been Grandma Rose's daughter-in-law once, before our uncle died in that car accident 15 years ago, but she'd remained close to our grandmother even after remarrying. It would be good to have family support, especially since there weren't many of us left. As evening approached, we ordered Chinese takeout and ate it from the containers while sitting on Grandma's floral couch, watching old photo albums by the light of her antique table lamps. Rachel had gathered several albums from around the house, and we spent hours looking at pictures of holidays, birthdays, and ordinary moments that now seemed precious beyond measure. There we were as gap-toothed children, building sandcastles at the Oregon coast, and there was Grandma Rose teaching us to drive in the church parking lot when we were teenagers. Each photo told a story of love and patience, and the kind of unconditional acceptance that had made us both feel cherished. "She was so proud of you," Rachel said quietly as we looked at a picture from my college graduation. "She kept that article from the Business Journal about your promotion on her refrigerator for months." I felt a stab of guilt, remembering how busy I'd been lately, how our phone calls had become shorter and less frequent. Success in Chicago had demanded so much of my time and energy, and now I'd never get the chance to slow down and really talk with her again. The regret sat heavy in my chest as we closed the last photo album and prepared for what would be our first night in the house without her. I woke up in my old bedroom to the sound of rain pattering against the windows, the same sound that had lulled me to sleep countless times during childhood summers. The room was exactly as I'd left it after high school. Purple walls that I'd thought were so sophisticated at 17, a bulletin board still covered with college acceptance letters and photos of friends I barely spoke to anymore. Rachel's room across the hall had been preserved too, though hers was all soft pinks and romantic touches that suited her personality perfectly. Grandma Rose had kept our rooms like shrines to our teenage selves. Downstairs, I found Rachel already dressed and sorting through more papers at the dining room table, her hair neat and her makeup carefully applied despite her obvious exhaustion. She'd always been better at maintaining appearances than I was, even in crisis. "The lawyer called," she said without looking up from a stack of documents. "Mr. Henderson wants to meet with us this afternoon about Grandma's will." Something in her tone made me pause as I poured myself coffee, but when I looked at her more closely, her expression was unreadable. "Did she mention anything to you about her will?" I asked, settling into the chair across from her with my steaming mug. Rachel shook her head, still focused on the papers in front of her. "You know how private she was about money matters," she replied. "She just always said we'd be taken care of." That was true. Grandma Rose had never discussed finances with us, preferring to focus on family dinners and garden tours whenever we visited. But I'd assumed that whatever she had would be split between us equally, the way things usually worked in families. After breakfast, Rachel suggested we tackle the attic, something she'd been putting off since Grandma's death. "I can't face it alone," she admitted, and I understood completely. The attic had always been mysterious territory during our childhood visits, filled with trunks of old clothes and boxes of photographs that went back generations. Grandma Rose had sometimes let us explore up there on rainy days, but she'd always supervised, making sure we handled everything with care. Now it felt like we were trespassing in sacred space. The pull-down stairs creaked under our weight as we climbed up into the dusty space under the eaves, our phones providing flashlight beams to cut through the gloom. The attic was more organized than I'd expected, with clear pathways between stacked boxes and carefully labeled storage containers. Grandma Rose had been methodical about everything, even her collection of memories stored in this forgotten space. The smell of old wood and lavender sachets brought back a rush of childhood nostalgia that made my throat tight with emotion. "Look, at this," Rachel called from near the far window, holding up a wedding dress wrapped in yellowed tissue paper. It was Grandma Rose's dress from 1952, the one she'd worn when she married our grandfather in the little church downtown. The ivory silk was still beautiful despite its age, and I could picture her as a young bride, radiant with hope for the future she was building. We spent the next hour carefully going through her hope chest, finding baby clothes that had belonged to our father and handwritten letters from our grandfather during his brief deployment to Korea. In a corner near the chimney, I discovered a small wooden box I'd never seen before, tucked behind some Christmas decorations that hadn't been used in years. The wood was dark with age and carved with intricate roses that matched the pattern on Grandma's favorite china. When I opened it, I found it filled with legal documents, property deeds, stock certificates, and what looked like insurance policies. My hands trembled slightly as I realized I was looking at financial records that painted a very different picture of our grandmother's wealth than I'd ever imagined. "Rachel, you need to see this," I called, my voice echoing strangely in the cramped space. She made her way over carefully, stepping around boxes of old books and china serving pieces. When she saw what I'd found, her face went pale in the dim light from our phones. "Oh my God," she whispered, reaching for one of the stock certificates. "Emma, do you realize what these are worth?" I was doing rough calculations in my head, and the numbers were staggering. Grandma Rose had been quietly accumulating wealth for decades, investing wisely and never spending frivolously. The insurance policies alone were worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and there were investment accounts I'd never heard her mention. One certificate showed she owned a significant amount of stock in a technology company that had exploded in value over the past 5 years. Another document revealed she owned 3 rental properties in addition to the house we were sitting in, properties that generated monthly income I'd never known existed. My practical mind immediately began wondering about tax implications and estate planning, while my heart felt amazed by this secret side of the woman I thought I knew completely. "We need to take all of this to the lawyer," Rachel said, carefully gathering the documents back into the wooden box. Her hands were shaking slightly, and I noticed she avoided making eye contact with me as we prepared to climb back down to the second floor. Something about her demeanor had shifted since we'd made our discovery, a subtle change that I couldn't quite identify but that made me uneasy. As we descended the creaky stairs with our treasure trove of family secrets, I had no idea that the real shock was still waiting for us at Mr. Henderson's office that afternoon. Mr. Henderson's law office occupied the second floor of a historic, brick building downtown, the kind of place that had probably served Portland families for generations. The waiting room smelled like leather furniture and old books, and the receptionist spoke in hushed tones that seemed appropriate for the solemn business of dividing up someone's life. Rachel sat beside me on the burgundy leather couch, her purse clutched tightly in her lap, while we waited for our appointment. She'd been quiet during the drive over, lost in thought in a way that made me want to ask what was bothering her. But grief affects everyone differently, and I figured she was just processing everything we discovered in the attic. When Mr. Henderson finally called us into his office, he greeted us with the kind of professional sympathy that comes from decades of helping families navigate loss. He was older than I'd expected, probably in his 70s, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His desk was covered with neat stacks of papers, and I could see copies of the documents we'd found in the attic among them. "Please sit down," he said gently, gesturing to 2 chairs positioned in front of his massive oak desk. "I know this is a difficult time for both of you." Rose was a remarkable woman, he continued, settling into his leather chair with a slight grunt. She'd been my client for over 20 years, and I watched her build quite an impressive portfolio. Through careful planning and smart investments. He paused to put on his reading glasses before reaching for a thick document bound in blue covers. She was very specific about her wishes, and she updated her will just 6 months ago to make sure everything was exactly as she wanted it. Something cold settled in my stomach at those words, though I couldn't explain why. Mr. Henderson opened the will and began reading in his measured, professional voice, starting with the standard legal language about sound mind and disposing of earthly possessions. But as he continued, I felt like the room was tilting around me. The house on Elm Street, the rental properties, the investment accounts, the life insurance policies, everything was going to Rachel. Not split between us, not divided equally like I'd always assumed it would be. Everything to my sister, with a brief mention that I would receive Grandma Rose's jewelry and personal effects. The financial empire we'd discovered that morning, worth well over $1 million, would belong entirely to Rachel. "I don't understand," I managed to say, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. "There must be some mistake." Mr. Henderson looked at me with genuine sympathy, then glanced at Rachel, who was staring down at her hands folded in her lap. "I'm afraid there's no mistake, Emma," he said softly. Rose was very clear about her intentions. She felt that Rachel's financial situation, with her family responsibilities and her husband's recent job loss, required more substantial support. David had lost his job? This was the first I was hearing about it, and I turned to look at Rachel with confusion and growing hurt. Rachel finally met my eyes, and I saw guilt written across her face, along with something that looked almost like relief. "I wanted to tell you," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But everything happened so fast with Grandma. Getting sick, and then—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. The silence in the office was deafening, filled only by the ticking of an antique clock on Mr. Henderson's bookshelf. I felt like I was drowning, struggling to understand how the woman who'd raised us both could have made such a devastating choice. "When did David lose his job?" I asked, proud that my voice remained steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. 3 months ago, Rachel admitted, still not meeting my eyes directly. "The company downsized and he's been looking, but with Tyler's school expenses and the mortgage." She was explaining the practical reasons, the financial pressures, that had apparently prompted Grandma Rose to rewrite her will. But all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears as I tried to process this betrayal. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat diplomatically and continued reading, explaining the specifics of how Rachel would inherit everything, and when the various accounts would be transferred to her name. He mentioned that there were some charitable donations Grandma Rose had specified, modest amounts to the church and the local animal shelter, but the vast majority of her estate would go to my sister. The jewelry I was inheriting included Grandma's wedding rings, her pearl necklace, and a few other pieces that were probably worth a few $1,000s at most. It felt like receiving crumbs from a feast I'd never been invited to attend. Did she leave any explanation? I asked when Mr. Henderson finished reading. Any letter or message about why she made this decision? He shook his head regretfully, explaining that Grandma Rose had been very businesslike about the whole process, focused on the practical aspects rather than the emotional ones. She'd apparently told him that she trusted both of us to understand her reasoning, but she hadn't left any personal messages or explanations. The absence of even a note felt like another slap in the face, another indication that I'd somehow failed to earn her love in the way Rachel had. As we left the lawyer's office and walked to the parking garage in silence, I felt like I was moving through thick fog, unable to think clearly about what had just happened. Rachel kept glancing at me nervously, clearly wanting to say something but not knowing where to start. The Portland afternoon was gray and drizzly, matching my mood perfectly as we got into her SUV for the drive back to the house. I stared out the passenger window at the familiar streets, wondering how everything I'd thought I knew about my family had turned out to be wrong. The woman I'd loved and trusted most in the world had chosen my sister over me, and I didn't even know why. The drive back to Grandma's house passed in suffocating silence, with Rachel occasionally opening her mouth as if to speak before closing it again without saying anything. I stared out the passenger window at the familiar neighborhoods, seeing them with new eyes now that I knew I'd never have any claim to the house where I'd spent the happiest summers of my childhood. When we pulled into the driveway, I couldn't bring myself to get out of the car immediately, needing a moment to steel myself for the conversation I knew we had to have. Rachel turned off the engine but made no move to leave either, both of us sitting in the gray afternoon light like actors who'd forgotten our lines. "Emma, please say something," Rachel finally whispered, her voice thick with tears she was trying to hold back. "I know you're angry, and you have every right to be, but please don't shut me out." I turned to look at her then, really look at her, and saw my sister as if for the first time. She'd always been the one who stayed close to home, who visited Grandma Rose every weekend and called her twice a week. While I was building my career in Chicago, Rachel had been here, present and available in ways I hadn't been. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Maybe I'd been so focused on my own life that I'd missed what was happening in theirs. Inside the house, we sat at the kitchen table where we'd shared so many childhood meals, the silence between us heavy with unspoken accusations and hurt feelings. Rachel made tea with shaking hands, spilling sugar on the counter, and apologizing repeatedly for the mess. I watched her nervous movements and realized she was terrified, not just of my anger, but of losing our relationship entirely. "How long have you known?" I asked finally, my voice coming out sharper than I'd intended. "About the will, I mean. How long have you known what she was planning to do?" Rachel's face crumpled, and fresh tears started flowing down her cheeks as she admitted the truth. "She told me 2 months ago," she sobbed, "right after David lost his job and we were talking about maybe having to sell the house. She said she wanted to make sure Tyler could stay in his school district and that we wouldn't lose everything we'd worked for." The practical reasons made sense from Grandma Rose's perspective, but they didn't ease the sting of being excluded from that conversation entirely. Why hadn't anyone thought to discuss this with me? Why hadn't I been given a chance to understand or offer my own support? "She said you were doing so well in Chicago," Rachel continued, wiping her eyes with a tissue. "She was so proud of your success, your apartment, your career. She thought you didn't need the money the way we did." There. It was not the assumption that had cost me my inheritance. Because I lived independently and had a good job, because I'd worked hard to build a life for myself, I was somehow less deserving of our grandmother's legacy. The irony wasn't lost on me that my success had been used as justification for leaving me with virtually nothing. I stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that looked out over Grandma's carefully tended garden, now showing the first signs of autumn neglect. "Did it ever occur to either of you to ask me how I felt about it?" I said, trying to keep my voice level. "Maybe I would have understood about David's job. Maybe I could have helped in other ways. But instead, you both just decided I didn't need to be part of the conversation." The exclusion hurt almost as much as the financial loss, the feeling that I'd been written off without anyone bothering to consider my feelings or wishes. Rachel joined me at the window, standing close enough that I could smell her familiar perfume, the same scent she'd worn since high school. "I wanted to tell you so many times," she said quietly. "But Grandma made me promise not to say anything until it was too late to change her mind. She was worried you might try to talk her out of it, or that it would cause family drama before she died." The conspiracy of silence felt like another betrayal, another indication that I'd been seen as someone who would cause problems rather than someone who deserved to be included in family decisions. "You could have told me about David's job," I pointed out, feeling fresh anger rising in my chest. "You could have let me know you were struggling instead of letting me find out from a lawyer reading Grandma's will." Rachel nodded miserably, acknowledging that she'd been wrong to keep that secret too. She explained that David had been embarrassed about the job loss, that they'd been hoping he'd find something new quickly and wouldn't have to tell anyone. But as the weeks turned into months, their savings dwindled and the pressure mounted, until Grandma Rose stepped in with her offer of security. "I never wanted it to happen this way," Rachel said, turning to face me with red-rimmed eyes. "I kept hoping she'd change her mind, or at least leave you more than just the jewelry. When she updated the will 6 months ago, I begged her to reconsider. But she said her mind was made up. 6 months ago, that meant Grandma Rose had been planning this for longer than I'd realized, long before David's job loss became critical. The timeline suggested this wasn't just about Rachel's immediate financial needs, but about some deeper judgment Grandma Rose had made about both of us. As evening approached and we sat in the living room surrounded by photo albums and memories, I found myself looking at our childhood differently. Had there always been signs that I was less favored? Had I missed subtle indications that Rachel was the preferred granddaughter? Or was this simply the practical decision of an elderly woman trying to take care of a family member she saw as more vulnerable? The questions swirled in my mind as we prepared for another difficult night in the house that would soon belong entirely to my sister, wondering if our relationship could survive this revelation. The funeral was tomorrow, and I knew I'd have to find a way to put my hurt and anger aside long enough to honor Grandma Rose's memory with dignity. But as I lay in my childhood bed that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the house settle around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything I'd believed about love and family and fairness had been fundamentally shaken. The woman I'd trusted most in the world had made a choice that felt like rejection, and I didn't know if I'd ever be able to understand or forgive it. The morning of Grandma Rose's funeral dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of brilliant October sunshine that made Portland look like a postcard, despite the circumstances that had brought us all together. I stood in front of the mirror in my childhood bedroom, adjusting my black dress and trying to apply makeup over eyes that were already puffy from another sleepless night. Rachel knocked softly on my door, dressed in a simple black suit that made her look older and more sophisticated than usual. "Are you ready?" she asked gently, and I nodded even though I felt anything but prepared for the day ahead. The funeral home was already filling with people when we arrived, a testament to how many lives Grandma Rose had touched during her 87 years in Portland. I recognized neighbors from Elm Street, members of her church congregation, former co-workers from the library where she'd worked for 30 years before retiring. Rachel moved through the crowd gracefully, accepting condolences and thanking people for coming, while I struggled to make small talk with relatives I hadn't seen in years. Every conversation felt surreal, as if I were watching someone else's life unfold rather than participating in my own grandmother's memorial service. Aunt Patricia arrived just as the service was beginning, her silver hair perfectly styled despite her red-rimmed eyes and the obvious signs of grief etched on her face. She hugged both Rachel and me tightly, whispering how sorry she was for our loss and how proud Grandma Rose had been of both her granddaughters. Her words stung more than she could have known, given what I'd learned about the will, but I managed to smile and thank her for making the trip from Seattle. She settled between us in the front pew, providing a buffer that I was grateful for as the minister began speaking about Grandma Rose's life and legacy. The service was beautiful and heartfelt, filled with stories about Grandma Rose's kindness, her volunteer work at the animal shelter, and her famous apple pies that she brought to every church potluck. Several people spoke about how she'd helped them through difficult times, offering practical support along with emotional comfort. I found myself crying not just for my loss, but for the realization that there were so many sides to my grandmother I'd never fully appreciated. Perhaps her decision about the will reflected that same practical kindness, her desire to help where help was most needed, even if it meant making choices that seemed unfair on the surface. At the graveside service, I stood between Rachel and Aunt Patricia as we watched Grandma Rose's casket being lowered into the ground next to our grandfather's grave. The cemetery was peaceful, filled with mature oak trees that were just beginning to turn gold and red with autumn colors. Rachel threw a single white rose onto the casket, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs, and I followed suit with a rose of my own. As the minister said the final prayers and people began to disperse, I felt a strange sense of finality that went beyond just losing my grandmother. It felt like the end of my childhood understanding of how families were supposed to work. Back at the house after the service, neighbors and church members filled the rooms with food and gentle conversation, the way people do when they're trying to comfort the grieving. Aunt Patricia helped Rachel organize the potluck dishes that had appeared as if by magic, while I found myself gravitating toward Grandma Rose's study, seeking quiet in the midst of all the activity. The room still smelled like her lavender perfume, and the lemon oil she used to polish her antique desk. I sat in her reading chair and closed my eyes, trying to feel some connection to her spirit, some understanding of why she'd made the choices she had. "She talked about you constantly, you know," Aunt Patricia said from the doorway, making me jump slightly. She came into the study and closed the door behind her, giving us privacy from the crowd and the rest of the house. "Every time I called, she had some new story about your job or your apartment or some achievement she'd read about in your emails." Her words were meant to comfort, but they only highlighted the disconnect between how proud Grandma Rose had been of my success and how that success had ultimately worked against me in her final decisions. "Then why did she leave everything to Rachel?" I asked, the question I'd been holding inside finally spilling out. Aunt Patricia looked genuinely surprised, her eyebrows rising as she processed what I'd said. "What do you mean, everything?" she asked, settling into the chair across from me. "I assumed she'd split things between you girls the way most people do." Her shock at learning about the will's contents was somehow both comforting and disturbing. If even Aunt Patricia hadn't known about Grandma Rose's decision, then the secrecy had been even more extensive than I'd realized. I explained what we'd learned at the lawyer's office, watching Aunt Patricia's expression shift from surprise to concern, to something that looked almost like anger. "That doesn't sound like Rose at all," she said slowly, shaking her head. "She always talked about treating you girls equally, about how important it was that you both felt loved and valued." She was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the garden where Grandma Rose had spent so many peaceful hours. "There has to be more to this story," she said finally. "Rose wouldn't have made such a dramatic decision without a compelling reason." As the afternoon wore on and the last of the guests finally departed, the three of us, Rachel, Aunt Patricia, and I, found ourselves alone in the house that had been the center of our family for so many years. The kitchen was filled with leftover casseroles and desserts from well-meaning neighbors, and Rachel moved through the space mechanically, wrapping food and washing dishes as if staying busy could keep her emotions at bay. Aunt Patricia watched, both of us carefully, clearly sensing the tension between Rachel and me, even though we hadn't discussed the inheritance issue in front of her. "I think it's time we had a family meeting," Aunt Patricia announced, drying her hands on one of Grandma Rose's familiar dish towels. "There are obviously things that need to be discussed, and Rose wouldn't want her death to drive a wedge between her granddaughters." She was right, of course, but I wasn't sure a conversation would fix the fundamental issue of feeling rejected and undervalued by the person I'd loved most in the world. Still, as we settled around the kitchen table with cups of coffee and the weight of family secrets hanging between us, I knew we had to try to find a way forward that honored both our grief and our need to remain connected as the only family we had left. Aunt Patricia insisted we search through Grandma Rose's personal papers more thoroughly, convinced there had to be some explanation for the shocking disparity in the will. Rose was meticulous about everything, she said, pulling out drawers in the antique secretary desk in the living room. If she made such a significant decision, she would have documented her reasoning somewhere. Rachel and I exchanged glances, both of us exhausted from the emotional roller coaster of the past few days, but we began systematically going through every drawer, folder, and box we could find in the house. It was Rachel who discovered the hidden compartment in Grandma Rose's jewelry box, the one that had sat on her dresser for as long as I could remember. While I was going through her closet and Aunt Patricia was checking the hall closet, Rachel called out excitedly from the bedroom. "There's something here," she said, her voice tight with anticipation and nervousness. We rushed to where she stood, holding an envelope with my name written on it in Grandma Rose's familiar handwriting, along with another envelope addressed to Rachel. My hands shook as I took the letter meant for me, afraid of what I might find inside. The letter was dated just 3 weeks before Grandma Rose's death, written in her slightly shaky handwriting that had become more pronounced in recent months. I sat on the edge of her bed, the same bed where she'd read me bedtime stories during childhood visits, and carefully unfolded the pages with trembling fingers. "My dearest Emma," it began, and I had to pause to compose myself before continuing. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone and you've learned about my will. I know you must be hurt and confused, and I owe you an explanation for what must seem like an unforgivable betrayal." The letter went on to explain that Grandma Rose had been watching both of us carefully over the years, not just our successes, but our struggles and our character. She wrote about how proud she was of my independence and strength, how I'd built a life for myself that didn't require anyone else's support or approval. "You have something Rachel doesn't have," the letter continued, "the confidence and capability to create your own security. You've never needed anyone to rescue you, and that's a gift worth more than any inheritance I could leave you." Her words were meant to be complimentary, but they still stung with the implication that my self-reliance had cost me her financial support. But then the letter took an unexpected turn, revealing information that changed everything I thought I understood about our family situation. Grandma Rose had discovered, through her own investigation, that David hadn't just lost his job. He'd been fired for embezzling money from his employer. The charges had been dropped in exchange for full restitution, but it had wiped out all of Rachel's savings and left them deeply in debt. "Rachel doesn't know that I know," the letter explained, "but I hired a private investigator when their story about downsizing didn't add up. Your sister has been protecting a man who stole from his own company, and she's too loyal to leave him even though he's destroying their financial future." My hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold the pages as I continued reading. Grandma Rose had witnessed Rachel making excuse after excuse for David's behavior, taking on extra nursing shifts to pay off debts she didn't even know existed. She'd watched my sister sacrifice her own well-being to keep their family together, all while David looked for ways to blame everyone but himself for their problems. "I'm leaving everything to Rachel because she's going to need it to survive what's coming," the letter continued. "David's problems are bigger than she realizes, and when the truth comes out, she'll need every resource I can give her to protect herself and Tyler." The final paragraph of the letter contained an instruction that made my breath catch in my throat. "There's a safety deposit box at First National Bank downtown," Grandma Rose had written. "The key is taped under the bottom drawer of my jewelry box, and I've added your name to the signature card. Inside, you'll find bonds and cash that David doesn't know about. Money I've been setting aside specifically for you. It's not as much as Rachel's inheritance, but it's substantial enough to make up for what you might feel you've lost. More importantly, it's there because I wanted you to have something that was truly yours, something no one else could touch or claim." I looked up from the letter to find Rachel and Aunt Patricia watching me anxiously, clearly desperate to know what I'd discovered. Rachel's face was pale with worry, and I realized she was terrified that the letter might contain some criticism of her or explanation of why she wasn't worthy of the inheritance. "What does it say?" she whispered, her voice barely audible in the quiet bedroom. I folded the letter carefully, my mind racing as I tried to process everything I'd learned and decide how much to share. "She knew about David," I said simply, watching Rachel's face crumble as she understood the implications. "She knew why he really lost his job, and she was trying to protect you." Rachel sank into the antique chair by the window, her face in her hands as the weight of family secrets finally came crashing down around her. Aunt Patricia moved to comfort her, but her eyes remained fixed on me, clearly sensing there was more to the story than I was revealing. I explained about the embezzlement and the debts, watching Rachel's shoulders shake as she absorbed the truth about her husband's betrayal. "I should have known," she sobbed. "All those nights he was working late, all the excuses about why our credit cards were maxed out, I was so stupid to believe him." Aunt Patricia wrapped her arms around Rachel, making soothing sounds while shooting me a look that clearly asked if there was anything else they needed to know. "There's more," I said, pulling the safety deposit box key from where I'd found it taped exactly where the letter had indicated. "She left me something separate, something David can't touch, even if he tries to claim part of your inheritance." The key felt heavy in my palm, representing not just financial security, but Grandma Rose's continued love and protection even from beyond the grave. She'd found a way to be fair to both of us while protecting Rachel from a future she was only beginning to understand. As the three of us sat in Grandma Rose's bedroom, surrounded by the remnants of a life well lived and the shocking revelations that changed everything we thought we knew, I felt a strange sense of peace settling over me. The inheritance wasn't about favoritism or love. It was about Grandma Rose trying to protect both her granddaughters in the ways we each needed most. She'd given Rachel the resources to survive her husband's betrayal and rebuild her life, while ensuring I had security that no one else could threaten or destroy. In her final act of love, she'd managed to take care of us both, even if it had taken this long for us to understand her wisdom. The next morning, Rachel and I drove to the bank together, the safety deposit box key clutched in my sweaty palm as we navigated through Portland's downtown traffic. Rachel had been quiet since reading her own letter from Grandma Rose the night before, which had contained similar revelations about David's theft, along with gentle encouragement to think carefully about her future. She'd called David after breakfast to tell him we needed to have a family meeting when we returned to her house that afternoon, her voice steady despite the emotional storm I knew was raging inside her. The conversation had been brief and tense, with David clearly sensing something was wrong, but Rachel refusing to explain over the phone. At First National Bank, the process of accessing the safety deposit box felt surreal, like something from a movie rather than my actual life. The bank employee, a professional woman about my age, led us into the secure area and used both her key and mine to open the narrow metal drawer. Inside, I found neat stacks of savings bonds, cash bundled with rubber bands, and another letter, in Grandma Rose's handwriting. The bonds alone were worth over $200,000, money she'd been quietly accumulating for years without telling anyone. There was also a folder containing documentation that she'd been paying into a separate investment account in my name for the past 5 years. "She really did love us both," Rachel whispered as we counted the bonds, her voice filled with wonder and fresh grief. "She just showed it in different ways." I nodded, finally understanding that Grandma Rose's decision hadn't been about choosing between us, but about recognizing our different needs and circumstances. She'd seen that I was strong, enough to build my own life while Rachel was trapped in a situation that would eventually destroy her without intervention. The safety deposit box represented her faith in my independence, while Rachel's inheritance represented her desire to give my sister the tools she'd need to start over. Back at Rachel's house in the suburbs, we spent the afternoon preparing for David's arrival home from his latest job interview. Rachel had been straightening things that were already clean and organizing drawers that didn't need organizing, nervous energy radiating from her as she tried to prepare for the most difficult conversation of her marriage. Tyler was at soccer practice, which gave us privacy for what we all knew would be a confrontation that could change their family forever. I sat at their kitchen island, watching my sister pace and wondering if she had the strength to face the truth about her husband. David arrived home just after 5, his tie loosened and his expression already defensive as he walked into the kitchen, where Rachel and I waited. He was a handsome man in his early 40s, with the kind of easy charm that had probably helped him talk his way out of trouble his entire life. But today his smile seemed forced, and his eyes darted nervously between Rachel and me as if he sensed danger. "What's this about?" he asked, loosening his tie further and reaching for a beer from the refrigerator. "You sounded strange on the phone." "We need to talk about why you really lost your job," Rachel said, her voice steady despite the tremor I could see in her hands. David's face went pale, and I watched him calculate his options in the few seconds of silence that followed. He tried to bluster his way through it at first, insisting that he'd been laid off along with several other employees due to budget cuts. But when Rachel produced copies of the police report that Grandma Rose had obtained through her private investigator, his entire demeanor changed from defensive to desperate. "It wasn't my fault," he said, slumping into one of their kitchen chairs as if the weight of his secrets had finally become too much to bear. "The company owed me money for overtime they never paid, and I was just taking what was already mine." His justification sounded hollow even to him, and Rachel's face grew harder with each excuse he offered. I could see her realizing that this was probably not the first time he'd justified taking something that didn't belong to him, just the first time he'd been caught. The full scope of their financial disaster became clear as David reluctantly admitted to credit card debts, unpaid bills, and money borrowed against their home equity that Rachel knew nothing about. He'd been living a double life for months, maintaining the appearance of normalcy while their financial foundation crumbled beneath them. "How much?" Rachel asked quietly, and when David mumbled a figure that represented more than their annual household income, I saw something break inside my sister's eyes. The betrayal wasn't just about the stealing, it was about the lies, the deception, and the way he'd let her sacrifice her own well-being to pay for his mistakes. "I can fix this," David said desperately, reaching for Rachel's hand across the table. "That interview today went really well, and once I'm working again, we can get back on track." But Rachel pulled her hand away, her face settling into an expression of resolve I'd rarely seen from her. "There is no we anymore," she said quietly. "You need to pack some things and stay somewhere else tonight. I need time to think about what happens next." The finality in her voice surprised even me, and I felt proud of my sister for finally standing up for herself and her son. After David left with a hastily packed suitcase and a stream of promises he'd probably never keep, Rachel and I sat in her living room with cups of tea, processing the wreckage of the day's revelations. Tyler would be home from soccer practice soon, and she'd have to find a way to explain why his father wasn't living there anymore. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know how to be a single mom, or handle all this debt or start over at my age." I moved to sit beside her on the couch, taking her hand in mine the way we used to comfort each other as children. "Grandma Rose knew you could do it," I said, thinking about the wisdom in our grandmother's final decisions. "She wouldn't have left you the resources if she didn't believe you were strong enough to use them." We spent the evening making lists of practical steps, finding a divorce lawyer, talking to a financial advisor about managing the inheritance, figuring out how to explain the situation to Tyler. It would be difficult and painful, but for the first time in years, Rachel would have the freedom to make choices based on what was best for her and her son, rather than what would enable her husband's destructive behavior. As we planned her new future, I realized that Grandma Rose's greatest gift hadn't been money at all. It had been the chance for both of us to build lives we could be proud of. 3 months after Grandma Rose's funeral, I found myself back in Portland more often than I'd expected, splitting my time between my Chicago life and helping Rachel navigate her divorce proceedings. She'd filed for separation within a week of confronting David, and her lawyer was optimistic about protecting the inheritance from any claims he might make. My sister had transformed over these months, growing stronger and more confident as she realized she could manage on her own. She'd kept their house and was working with a financial advisor to invest Grandma Rose's bequest wisely, ensuring long-term security for herself and Tyler while still having enough to pay off David's debts. Tyler had adjusted to his parents' separation, better than any of us had expected, perhaps relieved to escape the tension that had filled their home for months without him understanding why. He spent alternate weekends with David, who had finally found a new job in Seattle and seemed to be making genuine efforts to address his problems. Rachel remained cautious about trusting him again, but she was gracious about co-parenting for Tyler's sake. "I don't hate him," she told me during one of my visits, "but I finally understand that loving someone doesn't mean accepting destructive behavior or sacrificing my own well-being to enable theirs." My own life had taken unexpected turns as well. The money from Grandma Rose's safety deposit box had given me options I'd never considered before, including the freedom to take risks with my career that I couldn't have afforded previously. I'd negotiated a remote work arrangement with my Chicago firm, and was spending increasing amounts of time in Portland, drawn back to the city where I'd spent the happiest times of my childhood. The irony wasn't lost on me that inheriting less money had actually given me more freedom than I'd ever had before, because it was mine alone with no strings or complications attached. Rachel had decided to keep Grandma Rose's house rather than sell it, moving herself and Tyler into the familiar Victorian on Elm Street, where we'd both spent so many magical summers. She'd updated the kitchen and bathrooms while preserving the character that made the house special, and seeing her arrange her furniture among Grandma's antiques felt like watching family history continue rather than end. Tyler loved having his own room in the house where his great-grandmother had lived, and Rachel said he often talked about feeling connected to family stories that went back generations. One afternoon in early spring, Rachel and I were working in Grandma Rose's garden, planting the vegetables she would have put in if she'd lived to see another growing season. The physical work felt therapeutic, and there was something healing about continuing traditions that connected us to her memory. "Do you think she knew this would happen?" Rachel asked, kneeling beside the tomato plants we were transplanting. "Do you think she planned for me to end up living here?" I considered the question as I worked compost into the soil, thinking about our grandmother's careful nature and her ability to see patterns and possibilities that others missed. "I think she hoped you'd have choices," I said finally. "The house gives you stability and a place where Tyler can grow up surrounded by family history. But she also left you enough money that you could sell it and start completely fresh if that's what would make you happier." Rachel nodded thoughtfully, brushing dirt from her hands as she surveyed the garden we were bringing back to life. She'd made peace with inheriting more than I had, understanding now that it wasn't about favoritism, but about Grandma Rose's assessment of what each of us needed to thrive. My relationship with Rachel had grown stronger through the crisis, bonded by shared grief and the discovery that family secrets aren't always what they appear to be on the surface. We talked more honestly now than we had in years, no longer comparing our lives or feeling competitive about who had achieved more or suffered less. The inheritance issue had forced us to confront difficult truths about fairness, need, and love, ultimately teaching us that equality doesn't always mean identical treatment. Sometimes love means giving people what they need most, even if it doesn't look fair from the outside. I'd also begun dating someone in Portland, a teacher named Michael, who I'd met at a coffee shop near Grandma Rose's house. He was nothing like the ambitious professionals I usually attracted in Chicago. Quieter, more grounded, interested in things like gardening and hiking and cooking meals from scratch. Our relationship was developing slowly and naturally, without the pressure and competition that had characterized most of my romantic life. When I told Rachel about him, she smiled and said he sounded like someone Grandma Rose would have approved of, focused on building a meaningful life rather than just accumulating achievements. The financial advisor I'd hired to manage my inheritance had helped me make some interesting discoveries about investment possibilities in Portland's growing tech sector. I was considering using part of the money to start my own marketing consultancy, something I'd always dreamed about but never had the security to attempt. The idea of building something of my own, of taking the skills I'd developed in Chicago and applying them to helping smaller, more innovative companies felt exciting in a way my corporate job had stopped being years ago. Grandma Rose's gift was giving me the chance to bet on myself rather than playing it safe. As summer approached and the anniversary of Grandma Rose's death grew closer, Rachel and I began planning a small memorial service in her garden, inviting the neighbors and church friends who had loved her. We wanted to celebrate what would have been her 88th birthday by sharing stories and continuing the traditions she'd valued most. The garden was flourishing under Rachel's care, and I knew Grandma Rose would have been proud to see how we'd both grown from the difficult lessons her death had taught us. Her final gift had been more than money. It had been the push we both needed to become the women she'd always believed we could be. 1 year after Grandma Rose's death, I stood in her garden on a warm October morning, watching Rachel harvest the last tomatoes of the season while Tyler helped by carrying the basket and chattering about his plans for Halloween. The scene felt achingly familiar, yet completely different from the grief-stricken days immediately following her funeral. Rachel looked healthier and more relaxed than I'd seen her in years, her divorce finalized, and her life settling into a new rhythm that belonged entirely to her and her son. Tyler had grown several inches and gained a confidence that came from living in a house filled with love rather than tension and secrets. My own life had changed dramatically over the past year, though in ways I never could have predicted when I first learned about the will. I'd left my Chicago job 6 months earlier to start my own marketing consultancy, working with small businesses and nonprofits in Portland and operating out of a converted office space downtown. The financial security from Grandma Rose's inheritance had made the transition possible, but the success of the business came from years of experience and a genuine passion for helping organizations tell their stories effectively. I was earning less money than I had in Chicago, but I was happier and more fulfilled than I'd been in years. Michael and I had moved in together in a craftsman bungalow in Southeast Portland, complete with a small garden where I was learning to grow herbs and vegetables under Rachel's patient tutelage. He'd proposed 3 months earlier with a simple ring and a heartfelt speech about wanting to build a life based on shared values rather than shared ambitions. Our wedding was planned for the following spring, a small ceremony in Grandma Rose's garden if Rachel agreed to host it. The idea of getting married in the place where I'd learned what family really meant felt like the perfect way to honor her memory while celebrating our future. Rachel's transformation over the year had been remarkable to witness. She'd completed a nurse practitioner program using part of her inheritance to pay for school, and she was now working at a community health clinic serving families who couldn't afford traditional health care. Her work gave her a sense of purpose that went far beyond financial security, and I could see Grandma Rose's influence in her desire to use her resources to help others. She'd also started dating a fellow nurse named Tom, a widower with teenage daughters who treated Tyler like their little brother and brought laughter back into Rachel's life. The house on Elm Street had become a gathering place for our small family, with Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations that felt both nostalgic and forward-looking. Tyler loved showing his friends the old photographs and telling them stories about his great-grandmother, keeping her memory alive in ways that honored her legacy while allowing it to evolve. Rachel had turned Grandma Rose's study into a homework space for Tyler while preserving the most meaningful books and mementos, creating a blend of past and present that felt natural rather than forced. As I stood in the garden on this anniversary, morning surrounded by the vegetables and flowers that Rachel tended with the same care Grandma Rose had shown, I finally understood the full scope of what our grandmother had given us. The money had been important, providing security and opportunities we wouldn't have had otherwise. But the real inheritance had been the lesson that love sometimes requires difficult choices, that fairness isn't always about equal distribution, and that trust sometimes means believing in someone's strength even when they don't believe in it themselves. Rachel joined me by the roses that were still blooming despite the cooler weather, her hands dirty from the morning's harvest and her face peaceful in a way that reminded me of Grandma Rose. "Do you think she'd be proud of how things turned out?" she asked, a question we'd both wondered about many times over the past year. I looked around at the thriving garden, the well-maintained house, and most importantly, at my sister who had found the courage to rebuild her life and my nephew, who was growing up surrounded by love and stability. "I think she'd be amazed at how well her plan worked," I said, meaning every word. "She saw things in both of us that we didn't see in ourselves, and she found a way to help us become who we were meant to be." The inheritance had initially felt like a betrayal, but time and perspective had revealed it as an act of profound wisdom and love. Grandma Rose had understood that Rachel needed resources to escape a destructive situation, while I needed the freedom that came from having security no one else could threaten or control. That evening, Rachel, Tyler, Michael, and I shared dinner at the kitchen table where I'd confronted the shocking news of the will a year earlier. The conversation was easy and comfortable, filled with laughter and plans for the future, rather than the grief and tension that had dominated our last meal in this room. Tyler regaled us with stories from his new school, where he was thriving, academically and socially, clearly benefiting from the stability his mother had been able to provide. Rachel looked radiant as she talked about her work and her relationship with Tom, no longer carrying the weight of secrets and financial stress that had aged her prematurely. As we cleaned up after dinner and prepared to part ways for the evening, I felt a deep sense of gratitude wash over me. Grandma Rose's death had initially felt like an ending, a loss that would leave an unfillable hole in our family. But her final gifts had actually been a beginning, launching both Rachel and me toward futures we wouldn't have had the courage or resources to pursue otherwise. She'd managed to take care of us both while teaching us valuable lessons about resilience, independence, and the different forms that love can take. Standing on the front porch of the house where I'd spent the happiest days of my childhood, I could almost feel Grandma Rose's presence in the evening air, satisfied with how her carefully laid plans had unfolded. She'd given us exactly what we needed, even though it had taken time for us to understand and appreciate her wisdom. The inheritance that had initially divided us had ultimately brought us closer together, stronger individually and more connected as family. As I drove home to the life I was building with Michael, I whispered a quiet thank you to the woman who had loved us enough to make difficult choices, trusting that we would eventually understand and forgive her for seeing us more clearly than we saw ourselves. Her final lesson had been her greatest gift, that true love sometimes means giving people what they need rather than what they want, and that wisdom often looks like unfairness until time reveals its deeper truth.